Thank you very much. Wow. Wait till I tell the kids. You know that my show began in 1967. And we knew we were boring visually. I mean, two talking heads and a group of women, mostly women, seated on folding chairs. And we were up against Monty Hall, who was giving away $5,000 to a woman dressed like a chicken salad sandwich. Come on down, spinning wheels. And here I am with one guest. And we were very concerned of whether we were going to survive in Dayton, Ohio. We were a local show. And we knew the only chance we had was to feature issues about which people cared, issues not normally seen on TV. So my first guest was Madalyn Murray O'Hair, the atheist. And she put her elbows on the table, leaned across, and looked me right in the eye, a 1957 graduate of the University of Notre Dame. And she said, "There is no God, there's no heaven, there's no hell, there are no angels. When you die, you go in the ground, you biodegrade, and you become part of the physical universe." Well, the building fell down in Dayton, Ohio. People in the barbershops didn't leave the barbershop after their hair got cut. And suddenly everybody knew in Dayton that there was this new show on TV. Our third guest was an actual, real live, this is 1967, and we featured a live homosexual right here on our show. Nobody was out in 1967. Mothers thought their children would catch it. Why were we aggrandizing this person by putting him on TV? And of course, I was pretty nervous myself. If people think I'm queer, there goes, there's going to be a pretty short live show. And sure enough, that afternoon, a woman on downtown Dayton came up to me and she said, "Well, who's your friend?" Birds of a feather. Sponsors canceled. But the first rating book that came down had us a 50 share, an unheard of number in our game at that time. And so we had the numbers that somehow gave the courage to the general manager who was answering questions from the flagship station in Cincinnati, run by an Irish Catholic. "What are you doing with our station?" And he was able to hold off sponsors that canceled. He was able to hold off the people that he reported to. And then we put another gay person on. And then another one. And we started, after several months, we realized we were meeting a lot of nice people. And we developed a very positive reputation within the politically active gay community. They knew they were safe if they came to the Donahue Show. They knew they were going to take incoming from the audience, but that was okay. The host would have their back. And in the mid-'80s, if you think I'm bragging, I am. This will just take a moment. I received the first GLAAD award, Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, the first media GLAAD award. All right. I'm not kissing a baby here now. I want to make a point. I was at Midtown Manhattan, and it was at the Time Life Hospitality Suite. There were like 12 people there. And I got my picture taken with the plaque. They called me 25 years later, GLAAD did, and they said, we'd like you to come to our annual banquet. We want to honor you on the 25th anniversary of your receiving the first Media GLAAD Award. So off I go to Marquis Marriott Hotel, largest ballroom in the city, wall-to-wall tables, not an empty seat. Around the wall were Fortune 500 logos, IBM, General Electric, American Airlines, Texaco. The red carpet, there were more photographers there than there were people 25 years earlier. Cherry Jones, the actress, gave me my award. And I couldn't help but think of how courageous those first gay guests were, who came out of the closet in the late 60s on television to announce that they were gay and they were proud, and that gayness, homophobia can be lethal. And one of the greatest promoters of homophobia is the Christian church, with the Catholic Church right in the middle of that crowd. Still there, still in the 12th century. But how far we have come, and what a lucky duck I am, because of my show, to have been a small part of this revolution which moved with warp speed. An achievement. You know, people, the right-wing community of our nation is fond of saying that liberals don't like anything about America. I guess we're not liberals anymore, we're progressives. So, excuse you for breathing. Yeah, I mean, really, that's how our name has been so bastardized. We changed it. Liberal is the political idea that dare not speak his name. And I want those people who complain about our absence of patriotism to know some of the experiences that I've had as the blessing of being a talk show host. I mean, I met everybody. People running for office, people going to jail, sometimes the same people. And how much I've come to appreciate, for example, more than ever before, as a result of the wonderful, mind-opening experiences that I've had on my own show, how much I appreciate the vision of the framers. Just a couple of examples. Lawrence v. Texas, speaking of gayness, two cops in Lawrence, Texas, parked outside at night because they knew them queers were living right there in that house. And they broke in the house, flashlights, what's going on in here? And they were convicted. Consensual sex between two people of the same sex is against the law. This was the beginning of the end of anti-sodomy laws. And the lawyers from the ACLU who carried this appeal from one level of court to the next finally got to the Supremes. Now remember, this was not 9-0. This was not a unanimous decision. Two members of the Supreme Court at the time, the deceased Scalia and Justice Clarence Thomas actually believed, presumably Thomas continues to believe today, that if a state wants to pass a law prohibiting consensual sex in the privacy of one's own home between two people of the same sex, it may do so. It may prohibit this behavior. It is constitutionally permissible to prohibit this behavior. What kind of country do you want? And the lawyers who argued for the petitioner, seated in the grand atrium of the Supreme Court, could not breathe as the 9 robed figures entered and took their position behind the bench. And Justice Anthony Kennedy, a Catholic, by the way, read the decision. And when he got to this line, there are some places in a person's life the state may not enter. And with that, the members of the ACLU dropped their heads and softly wept. This is what makes me such a proud American. These are the moments in our history that should be highlighted, that should be part of curriculum of all students, lawyers or not. These are great moments in history, and they justify what we so proudly call exceptionalism. I mean, I think we're exceptional too, but I do think it would probably be better if somebody from another country said that about us. Just one more. Jehovah's Witness. I'm telling you, Jehovah's kids wouldn't salute the flag, prohibited by their faith. And when the whole class would stand and offer their salute, I pledge allegiance to the flag, Jehovah's Witness kids. Little William Gobitis held onto the pocket of his breeches because the teacher kept trying to get him to get that hand up. You little bastard. Well, I don't know. I wasn't there. The Supremes came down in June of 1940 and said, you have to salute. What's wrong with mandating a salute? It imbues young people with a sense of patriotism and faith and democracy and admiration for their country. There were 1,000 injuries following that decision. Somebody burned down their Kingdom Hall, which they, as you know, they called their house of worship, in Kennebunk, Maine. There were over 1,000 injuries. A witness in Iowa was castrated. I talked to Lillian Gobitis 3 years ago, who was a child at the time, or a young girl. And I said, did they really castrate Mrs. Gobitis? She said, yes, and I saw him last week, and he has a high voice, but he's fine. I said, well, thank you for too much information, but 3 years later, and by the way, in the first decision in which the Supremes said you have to salute, concurring in that decision, William O. Douglas, Felix Frankfurter, some of the most brilliant names in the history of the court. Yes, salute. Now the Supremes take it back, 1943, June, 3 years to the month. And Robert Jackson, in one of the great flourishes, this is what attracted me to this story. Here's what he said. If there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, may prescribe what shall be orthodox in religion, nationalism, politics, or any other matters of opinion, nor may he force by word or act a belief therein. You can't force an American to believe anything. You can't force an American to believe in the Constitution, which grants the right not to believe in anything. Think of the brilliance of the framers who put that together. Think of the majesty of the evolution of the law. You can burn the flag. And how much faith it puts in the heart of the citizen who is so confident about the rightness and the strength of his own nation that he doesn't need a Gestapo telling people how to think. Fabulous. Now, I mentioned Ralph. Ralph and I go back to Unsafe, the 60s. And in 67, when I got my show, hanging on as I was, local show, I wanted Ralph more than any other guest. I just thought that was the damnedest thing I ever heard. General Motors sending women after him to trap him so they got, holy, what? I was absolutely stunned by this. And I guess you have to say I loved a good story, and this sure was. And I called Ralph. And I'll never forget the receptionist, his secretary. Phil who? I wasn't on in Washington. I wasn't anywhere except Dayton, Ohio. And I couldn't get Ralph. He was the get I couldn't get. And I heard he was coming to Cincinnati to make a speech or wherever. And so I drove to Cincinnati, which is only 60 miles south of Dayton. And I stood at the door as the plane pulled up. Comes down the steps this thin, gaunt figure with the skinny tie and the blue suit and shoes that he bought when he was a junior in high school. And I walked up and I said, "Hi, Ralph, I'm Phil Donahue." And I thought, when I greet him, he's going to say, "You came all the way to Cincinnati, how can I turn you down?" And he looked at me and he said, "You came all the way to Cincinnati, how can I turn you down?" So, wow, I got the biggest get I ever had. And I have no power. And we drove in my 57 Chevy with no seatbelts all the way to Dayton, where I took him to the hotel. And that night, I dreamt I killed Ralph Nader. I had an accident, and he didn't have any seatbelts. The next day, live on Channel 2 in Dayton, Ohio, WLWD, about 150, mostly women, housewives, seated on folding chairs. I remember, we're boring as hell. We're two talking heads. And Ralph starts. I'll never be able to recreate it as it happened. What you have to be alert to, and the reason that we want seatbelts, he began, is because of the second accident, the second crash, the one that takes place inside the car after the car collides with another object outside the car. Your relatives, the people you love, will bounce off a hard dashboard that should be padded. The driver will be impaled on a steering column that does not collapse. And worst of all, the door will fly open and bodies will eject, causing almost certain death. These women couldn't breathe. This was as compelling a television show as they'd ever attended. And it added to the nature of what we were doing. We had a program like no one else on TV. And it was the ability to get people like Ralph to come to Dayton, Ohio. People used to say, oh, the soapbox derby. And I'd say, no, that's Akron. Don't go to Akron. Ralph went on to become the most oft-featured guest in the 29-year history of my television program. Ralph, along with Sid Wolfe, who headed Public Citizen, Public Health Research Group. If your mother is falling down, if your grandmother is tripping, look in your medicine cabinet. This is just one of the many words of wisdom that Sid brought to my program. He put out a book, Best Pills, Worst Pills. And I said, and it was fabulous, this book. And I held it up and I said, you know, here, this you can have, they published, the center published it themselves. So they don't have to cut in with any publisher or any, I mean, this was, you know, recycled paper, typical Nader stuff. And I said, $10, you know, it wasn't $9.95, it was, you know, just a one thin green Hamilton. I don't know how many. The office, our office, and the office here in Washington, Ralph's office at Columbus, at DuPont Circle, was swamped. I mean, the lines were jammed. I don't know how many we sold. Maybe he'll tell you later. I don't want to, I'm already bragging too much. But this is just, I mean, I felt so good being, you know, this was a book that saved lives. And it was introduced to the public on a platform that had my name on it. I mean, what do I have to do to impress you people? Here's just I want to show you a video. Here's Ralph, and this is me just shortly after my first communion. This is Ralph on the Donahue Show. I think this is 1980. Roll the tape.
The question, why should we be willing to pay the Arabs, whether it's the Saudis or the Algerians or the Nigerians, $28, $35 a barrel and pay American oil producers $6? Now you tell me what logic there is to this.
Well, it's just, you see, this is an incredible statement you hear it constantly, Phil, from
It's
the oil
a
companies.
fact.
In other words, if the foreigners are ripping us off, why not let the U.S. oil companies rip us off, too?
John Swearingen, Chairman of the Board, Standard Oil.
Well, the fact of the matter is that the cost of producing oil in this country is a tiny fraction of what you're getting for new oil because you've hitched your oil price to the OPEC cartel, and the oil companies are working hand in glove. All right, let me ask
you make these assertions
All right.
over and over and over
How much
again,
does it
but
cost
they're
for
absolutely
Indian?
wrong.
All right, let's ask for a
$1.88
public figure. In 1972, what was oil selling for out of Texas and Louisiana per barrel?
In 1972, must have been selling for about $3.50 to $5 a barrel.
How much
Depending
is
on
that
what-
new oil selling today on the market?
New oil selling
Right.
today in West Texas, it must be selling for around $32 to $35 a barrel.
All right, that's almost tenfold. Do you know any industry in this country that has had a tenfold increase in its prices in 8 years and still is not satisfied and wants more?
Well,
I don't know
Mr.
any industry.
Nader,
Do you?
The Vice President of Public Relations for Standard Oil, who suggested that his chairman appear on television with Ralph Nader, was found floating face down in the Chicago River. There were so many other, which of course we do not have time to. Let me share with you a couple of other moments. And, you know, probably the most admired president next to Lincoln in our own history was Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was near divine. Ronald Reagan, all you have to do is mention his name. Every candidate always does. Here are two guests on the Donahue Show, each of whom is discussing then President Ronald Reagan.
Paint a very, very grim picture of the sitting President of the United States. You talk about a man who who speaks by 3x5 cards. You tell us about a meeting in which he was reading the wrong 3x5 cards. You tell us about a meeting in which he stared into space and apparently said nothing. And then somebody mentioned Hollywood or something, or baseball, and then suddenly he becomes animated.
Let me just say this. I think he's probably the laziest president I've ever seen. I don't say that he's not talented. I say he doesn't do his homework. He doesn't do his briefing. I say the President of the United States is the most powerful person in the world, and with that power goes responsibility.
Right.
You don't say to somebody, you're going to make the decisions.
There are a few things, maybe 15 or 20, that can only be transferred from an incumbent president to his successor. And I had prepared very greatly for this meeting with then Governor Ronald Reagan. And I had made notes about these things that only a president can tell to his successor. So I started going down the list and explaining them. Some of them were very complicated, and I noticed that he wasn't taking notes and so forth. So I finally said, Governor Reagan, would you like to have take some notes? He said, no, I don't need to. I can remember what you're telling me. So in about 2 or 3 more minutes, he finally said, can I have a copy of your notes? And so I called my secretary in, and she went out and made a copy of my notes, and I gave them to him. And then I proceeded with the rest of the items, and still noticed that he didn't write down anything. And I was under the impression that he couldn't retain, I could not have retained all that I was giving him verbally. So I thought it was an interesting encounter and also somewhat revealing.
Is interesting the word we want to go with here? Here's what I would think.
Yeah,
I think you went back to Roosevelt and said, holy cow, this guy doesn't seem to give...
That's pretty close.
It's a window onto media, really, journalism especially, at a time when I think American journalism has a lot on its mind and a lot to think about. I mean, just the Iraq War is just one example. You're welcome, sir. By the way, we'll talk about that tomorrow. For some reason known only to Ralph, he has invited me to speak 2 days here at our conference. I started at a radio station in Dayton, Ohio, in Adrian, Michigan. Adrian, Michigan, WABJ, the proverbial 250-watt radio station. I think the signal probably went just about across the street. I was the news director because I was the only person in the news department. I covered my first murder there. I played softball with the police department. I was on the team cultivating my sources. I covered City Hall, and I couldn't get over how powerful I was. I mean, my microphone, I could stop the mayor. I was like 22. I must have looked 12. I covered fires. You know, I'd get to that fire. What did it look like when you got here, Chief? He said, it looked like a fire, you idiot. What do you think? And I wondered what happened to WABJ, and I Googled WABJ, and I got Washington Area Black Journalists Association. I mean, this is just one of the passing wonderful features of old-time media. I covered the births at the local hospital. I reported them on the air, including the birth of my first child, Adrian, Michigan, 1959. We broadcast football games. I gave high school football scores. I announced the deaths from the coroner's office. The local issues that were so important to the local people. Where do you find that today? Today, radio is a canned, prepared musical puree put together at some foreign location and broadcast from a computer. Nobody works at a radio station anymore. It's just music. And by the way, it's either hard rock, soft rock. Once in a while, you get a classical station, and it's a broadcast format with no personality at all, and certainly no announcement of the local scores of football games or the local auto accidents and who's injured and who went to the hospital. So this is just some of the past landscape that I realize now, very privileged to have walked upon, simply because of the nature of the work that I was lucky enough to wind up in. Here's now who was more admired than the people from Camelot? Jack Kennedy. What a romantic figure he was. What a handsome figure he cut. Boy, I remember in my Catholic neighborhood, boy, Jack Kennedy could do no wrong. Here is a Donahue show, I think early 80s, featuring Judith Exner Now, where was the press on this? Now, remember, Monica brought this nation to a halt. Both chambers of Congress for 2 years. All Monica, all the time. Here's Judith Exner agreeing to talk about her relationship with Jack as long as I read the passage from her book that you're about to see. Judith Exner, 1980s.
You are in the Beverly Hilton Hotel, and it is at the moment of the Democratic Convention in this city in 1960. Jack Kennedy is appearing to gather the delegates needed for the nomination, but it is not yet a fait accompli. I believe this is the night before he was nominated. You go to the room where Jack is in the company of a number of people, and you notice a woman circling, as you say, like a bird of prey. These are your words. Jack came over and said, "I'm sorry about the mix-up, but everybody's going now. Just hold on because I want to spend some time alone with you." Jack took my hand and said, we should say that while this is happening, delegates for Jack Kennedy are coalescing at the convention center.
Yes.
All the phones are ringing, the backroom stuff, Daley and the Chicago delegates, everybody's getting ready to name Jack Kennedy the Democratic standard bearer. Jack took my hand and said, "Let's go into the other room. I want to talk to you." We went into the bedroom and sat on the end of his bed. As I looked up, I saw the tall, thin woman was standing at the other end of the room. She gave me a little smile and went into the bathroom, closing the door. While I was trying to figure out what she was doing there, I heard Jack say something about the three of us going to bed together. I will never remember his exact words because I just couldn't believe my ears. I think I said something like, "Oh God, Jack, how could you?" He said, "But it's all right, don't be afraid, I know you'll enjoy it." I thought, "Oh Lord, what's wrong with me?" He tried to kiss me and I pulled away. There was an anxious look on his face and I could see that he was puzzled by my rejection. I was crushed, I just couldn't believe it. He never stopped talking. He assured me the girl was safe, that she would never talk about it to a single soul, and there was nothing wrong with a menage a trois, that it was practiced widely and over again, that I would enjoy it. I know you. I know you'll enjoy it. You finally got out of that. You rejected
did.
this idea. You stand by this story, however.
Yes.
This makes Gary Hart look like a Boy Scout.
Very possibly because you don't know everything about Gary Hart, you know.
Not necessarily simultaneously. You had at this general time frame, 1960-61, an intimate relationship with Frank Sinatra, Sam Giancana, and Jack Kennedy. In view of, and incidentally, this information is all on the record. There's hardly anything newsworthy about what I'm saying here. The point should be made that at no time did I see any front page story in anybody's newspaper about the events that you have described in your book, and events which incidentally have never been refuted by anybody. So we are left to speculate now in 1988 what we should have known about our candidate in 1960. We're talking about a man after whom Catholic schools were named, not to mention a few airports.
I think that very possibly in some areas the press has overextended their curiosity, but I think that Jack was allowed to really get away with far too much. I didn't know it then, but I was not the only woman in Jack's life. There were numerous women that he was seeing, and I think that does, and this is not, and I don't want it misunderstood because I was a great admirer of his, and I think that it's important that we know a great deal more than we knew about Jack, that we know more about our leaders. And the press, there was a code of silence as far as his conduct was concerned. They did not write about it.
You were a beautiful young woman who was raised in wealth and naturally found yourself surrounded by wealthy and powerful people. But you do appear to have been used, considerably used. And now, 25 years later, you look up to find yourself alone and in grave health. you might be Exhibit A at the feminist convention. If anybody has reason for rage and bitterness, it would seem to be you.
Well, I can agree partially. I don't feel bitter. I'm not proud of the fact that I went with a married man, and I will be held accountable for my actions, and I am perfectly willing to be held accountable for my actions. I think the difficult part has been for me that somehow I'm made accountable for everyone else's actions, for Jack's actions, for Sam's actions, and that part of it, I'm not bitter, but I don't think it's at all fair. And it's part of the reason for my telling the true story. I'd have never, ever let anyone know about my relationship with Jack had the Intelligence Committee not leaked my name. Plus, they were putting me in grave danger by my not responding and my not making myself available. They were more or less hunting me down. But I really believe that had I told the truth at that time, I wouldn't be alive today. Johnny Roselli appeared before that committee, and he was dead a year later.
John Roselli's body was found in an oil drum in Biscayne Bay, or Dumbfounding Bay, out near Miami. Sam Giancana was shot in the head 7 times as he prepared breakfast in the basement of his Oak Park home for the man who was to be his murderer. And, of course, John F. Kennedy is also dead.
I'm from Boston. I just want to know, you say you're not the type person to have an affair with a married man. Are you the type to have an affair with a mass murderer?
I didn't.
Giancana is the man about whom
If
she
you
speaks.
think back, well, you are too young, but in 1960 we didn't know who Sam Giancana was, and I knew him as Sam Flood, and when I finally found out he was Sam Giancana, the name Giancana didn't mean anything to me. It was only later on that I found out exactly who he was, and most of the country. It was later.
Was the president aware that you were seeing Sam Giancana at the same time?
I wasn't seeing Sam Giancana, and that's the misconception. I was meeting with Sam Giancana only for Jack. I was only seeing him to pass the envelopes or the information and to set up meetings. It wasn't until after I was no longer seeing Jack that Sam and I became close friends. And that was only for a matter of a couple of months.
Did you not tell Jack that you were upset that the FBI was all over your house, your driveway,
yes,
and your
yes.
And he said, "Don't worry, what?"
He would say, "Don't worry about it. You've never done anything wrong. You're not doing anything wrong." He said, "Sam works for us."
Sam works for us.
Yes.
You stand by that quote.
Absolutely.
So the President of the United States is saying that the leading mobster in the United States works for him.
Yes.
Well, one of the dilemmas of being a journalist today, especially the TV people, is you have to, in order to succeed, especially on television, you have to be popular. People have to like you. And you often have to report things and interview people in a way that people do not like. And this can often be a career killer. So here I am, Exhibit A. You're about to watch the dismantling of Phil Donahue by none other than William Jefferson Clinton.
I know that the image that many Americans have of me, solely by hearing all these negative things, they know nothing about my life, about the kind of family I grew up in, about my background, about what I've done as governor. I think it's sort of warped. I don't blame anybody for having a negative impression. But I'm telling you, if you're worried about whether you'd have a president and a first lady and a family, committed to their child, committed to the future of this country and other people's children, that is not a worry. Mm-hmm. People shouldn't worry about that.
Right. Part of the Slick Willie problem is caused by what some analysts see as your ability to deflect questions and give answers which really don't speak.
We need the ability in politics to deflect some questions. You folks would kill us if we couldn't.
Well. But that's true. Except that...
Thank you very much.
Except that the deflection makes the problem grow even worse. Let me just talk to you for a moment about Gennifer Flowers. Now, here's a woman who gave some very detailed information to the Star about visits to Dallas and numbers of visits to her multiple dwelling apartment, the Quapaw Towers, I think it was called. The man who ran the towers is quoted as saying he saw your car, had to move the state driver because he was in a no parking zone several times.
He didn't say, and they didn't report, did they, that the Quapaw Tower is the main dwelling place for people active in Arkansas politics? That my closest friend and advisor in my administration lives there? That another cabinet member of mine lives there? That 2 other major appointees of mine live there? And it's a huge building.
Mm-hmm. Now.
And, you know, if somebody, he didn't say, and you didn't point out to these people, that I don't want to get into this. I would never even answer this if a year and a half before this occurred, that woman had not hired a lawyer and threatened to sue anybody who claimed that I'd ever had anything to do with her. She hired a lawyer and threatened to sue anybody, even had him draft a complaint to sue a local radio station if they said that. She then took $150,000 and changed her story. Now, you may want to credit that or not. Were it not for that, I would not even have discussed this. My view is, I told you the only facts I think you're entitled to know. Have I ever had any problems in my marriage? Yes. Are we in good shape now? Yes. Did we work them out? Yes.
So,
if I had been divorced, would you even be bringing this up? No. Should people be punished for keeping their marriage together? No. Is that a character question? Not for me. Mm-hmm. That's my position on this whole thing. I should point out also that the Los Angeles Times and one other analyst looked at those alleged tapes and said they'd been heavily spliced. And I'll tell you why, because there was talk on there that would have exonerated me. But I can't prove that because I didn't have the clippers, because I don't tape people's private telephone conversations. Mm-hmm. Now, I am not going to discuss the details of this any further. Mm-hmm. I've said all I've got to say about it. I'm running for president.
So, throwing myself on the media sword here then, and assuming that I will not enjoy the top of your most favored media list, if I were to ask you if you had an intimate relationship with Gennifer Flowers, you would say what?
I'd say what I've always said. I told the truth, and so did she the first time. So I've given you the answer.
So that this is a lie?
Her story is not true. The Gennifer Flowers story is not true. We're living in a world when if somebody says anything about you that's bad, you folks will publish it and worry about whether it's true later. Mm-hmm. Now, that's the truth. Now, but the main thing is, look, way back last fall, before any of this came up, before somebody had to go to the trouble to pay her $150,000, which is probably now well over $200,000 with the subsidiary television appearances and all this sort of stuff, I went to the press corps and I said, if you want somebody who's had a perfect marriage, go find somebody else. Don't vote for me. I said that. I don't believe that I or any other decent human being should have to put up with the kind of questioning you're putting me through now. Once you have been candid, once you've been open, once you have said that. I don't believe that. I think this is debasing our politics. I cannot tell you how many total strangers come up to me on the street and say, I used to believe in public life. I used to want to be in politics. I wouldn't run for office on the bet now, and I don't know how you put up with it. And I'll tell you why. Because believe it or not, Phil, there are people out there with futures that are worth fighting for. There are real problems in this country, and there are people who'd like to hear them discussed. And I've done my best to do it, and it's very difficult because people like you don't want me to.
All right, just so I understand here, are you denying these allegations, or are you saying that it's not fair to ask them?
I have given answers to that specific one. If it were not for the unique facts of that case, I wouldn't discuss any of them. I have given an answer about my life, which is sufficient. And I have been held to a different standard than any previous person in public life, near as I can figure.
Okay.
And now the press even says that I have. You'd have a lot of people that couldn't have served if they'd been put through what I've been through. Would we have been better off without all those presidents?
Well, it's up to you. What kind of media do you want? How much do you want to know about your president? Is character important to you? What does character mean? You know, at least I didn't bring the nation to a halt for 2 years, just about 2 years, and I didn't spend millions of dollars of public money looking up a dress. So we have here a conflict, not only within the journalist, him, herself, but within the citizenry. We are voyeurs. We watched all that Monica stuff. We can't deny that we didn't. And some of us were more leering than others. But at the same time, we have a responsibility to understand the pressure on people who run for public office. This is something that we have to decide what we want. We should have known that Jack Kennedy was dealing with the leading mob figure in the country. We should have known that. We should have known how vulnerable he was to blackmail, and that our president has a responsibility never to place himself in that kind of jeopardy. But getting there is very, very difficult, because we have a press who will take it on the chin if they appear to be harassing a popular president, especially. And, you know, there are millions of Americans who believe that to criticize a president is unpatriotic. We send thousands of young men and women to war to protect our way of life, at the center of which is free speech. And then when we exercise it at a time like, for example, of war, we're told to shut up and sing. So often our patriotism gets in the way of our understanding and the information that we should have to be responsible citizens. I feel obliged to say that Marlo wanted to come and see what y'all look like. But she's heard me speak, and she is otherwise engaged with her responsibilities to St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. She's engaged in what she calls the world's second oldest profession, fundraising. And in a way, it's a relief for me to be on the road without her, because people knock me over to get to her. Oh, Marlo, that girl, we just loved it, and Free to Be. Oh, our children wore that record out. I mean, and I'm standing there. So sooner or later, somebody will notice me and they say, oh, and we like you too, Merv. I've enjoyed my time with you, and I hope you have too. Thank you very much.
A cab in Chicago, and the taxi driver asks me, what do you do? And I said, I work for this new news network. Doesn't take corporate funding or government money, doesn't sell advertising. And he said, oh, you mean the real news? And I knew that was it. that was going to be the name.
Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Peres.
This is Shahrial Tajvidi.
My name is Thomas Hedges.
I'm Barna Noor.
We're here in front of the Greek Parliament where a very large crowd is gathering.
The site of the unrest 1 year ago after Freddie Gray was killed in police custody.
Manchester, New Hampshire for the primaries of the Democratic Party.
Washington, D.C. at the National Press Club.
Live from Ferguson, Missouri.
I'm Sharmini Peres coming to you from Athens.
Jessica Devereaux coming to you from Capitol Hill.
I'm Kayla Rivara, and this is the Real News of the Day.
In Maryland, 2,100 inmates are serving life with the possibility of parole.
Welcome to Reality asserts itself.
We're not doing the news just to understand. We're doing it because we want to make a difference. We want to make change. We don't want to live in a world of perpetual war and climate disasters and eroding living standards and chronic poverty. And we've realized that if we're going to make that difference, we need to talk to the people who need the change the most. That's working and poor people. That's why we're based in Baltimore.
The main idea of the name The Real News is that there's an objective world where economic interests dominate.
When you look at a police department, their primary mission is to protect wealth and property.
They think that they can do what they want to do, and the citizens have lost confidence.
But our role isn't just to report and expose. We go beyond critique and strive to answer the question, what are effective solutions?
When we covered the Baltimore protests against the murder of Freddie Gray and systemic police abuse, we said that the real problem was not just a few racist cops, but the role of police in enforcing laws that perpetuate chronic poverty and mass incarceration. Police act as a buffer between those who own stuff and those who don't. The more you own, the more you are served and protected.
The Real News gave a voice to the people most affected. For example, we hosted a town hall in a parking lot in Gilmore Homes, the community where Freddie Gray grew up.
We decided to have a town hall meeting today.
Little white children in their neighborhoods, they got skateboard rings, playgrounds, soft cushioned mats on their courts. Our children got the concrete jungle. Then they wonder why they so hard and so disrespectful. They don't have none to respect. What the hell do they have? Nothing.
The weakness of independent news sources, including ours, is that they have yet to capture a broad mass audience. Corporate media dominates.
We think the weak link in the corporate media chain exists in certain local markets. For example, the advertising-driven model of Baltimore's local television news leads it to target the mostly white and wealthy audience in Baltimore County. That's why 75% of their on-air talent is white in a city that's 65% black.
Of course, the issue is much deeper than who's on air. In a city where there were 348 murders in 2015, that's as many murders as New York, a city 13 times the size of Baltimore, local news turned tragedy into morbid infotainment. They don't ask questions that might lead to transformative change. They don't challenge those who have real power because they're owned by people who have such power. The nonprofit model of The Real News allows us to take on these issues with imagination and courage.